Welcome back to the channel for this video, Azure Functions, .NET, and a GraphQL endpoint. Time to get coding. So let's talk about why you're going to be making this GraphQL endpoint. Imagine this. I've got an Android application, I've been asked to build an iOS one, and 6 months down the track, I'm going to have a website. I know each of them have common logic. That means when updating that logic, I'm going to have to update all three. That's quite painful. Better option, separate out the logic and make an API endpoint. That means if I'm going to update the logic, I only update it on the API and I don't touch the applications. That's much better. Now when defining that API endpoint, I have a couple of different options. One is GraphQL. GraphQL is highly declarative. It means that I can get the name and gender in one call. The next call, I can get the favorite color. And that's great. Now each of those attributes also resolve out differently. So I might have favorite color coming from my internal database, but then I might make a different attribute called weather in your area, which comes from the local weather API. Let's look at how I can build an Azure function that implements GraphQL. So for getting started on the GraphQL endpoint, I'm going to need something to test it. For that, I'll use Postman. Now, Postman is great for modeling the different types of requests that my applications are going to be making against the endpoint in the future. The thing is, GraphQL is made up of two different elements. One is the GraphQL query, a query that returns an object. The other is the variables. Now the variables are used as arguments to the GraphQL query, but we'll touch them in another video. First, how does that query come across to being that object? Well, it comes to that object through going through your schema that you define for your GraphQL endpoint. We're going to define that schema in an Azure function. So let's create the Azure function first. Going across to terminal, I'm going to go func new. Func new is then going to prompt me for what I want. So I'm going to ask the CLI, the function core tools, CLI, to basically create a .NET isolated. That's going to give me a .NET function. Then I'm going to go Azure HTTP function. And then I'm going to go for the HTTP trigger, name it GraphQL. This is then going to deploy out that HTTP trigger, which means when it gets an HTTP request from the Android, iOS, or website application, the code's then going to run. Okay, let's switch across to Visual Studio Code. So to do that, I'm going to go code .. say hello GraphQL, and with that, Visual Studio Code is going to launch. So let's first bring in the class which defines that GraphQL request, i.e. having the query and the variables. So to do that, I'm going to bring in a utils folder. And if you look inside that utils folder, you notice there's one class called GraphQL request. And you can see there the query and the variables like we saw inside Postman. The next part, let's bring in our GraphQL code. And then once we bring in that GraphQL code, we'll notice that we don't have some of the dependencies, i.e. the GraphQL package. So to bring that in, I'm going to just bring in the dependencies into my CS proj. So going ahead and bringing them in, going to put them right here. And then after putting them in, I'm just going to go and tell Visual Studio Code yes to restore them. This means it'll go ahead and install those dependencies for me. We can then go across here and we've got one error left and it's our query. Well, this is our query that we need to define for our schema. That is, we're going to define our say hello query. Now to define that, let's go and do it. So first I'm going to do server as my folder. Then I'm going to create a file called Poco, which Poco stands for plain old CLR object. I don't want you to think too much about it. What it means is a very simple object. No methods, just attributes. So I'm going to use the same namespace. And then I'm going to create it. So I'm going to call one called message. Now on our message, we're going to have an attribute called phrase, like you saw before. And that's our Poco done. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do our types. Now our types is going to look like this. So same exact process. I'm going to put in the same namespace to make it easy. In the future though, you should put them into separate namespaces. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to make my other class. So I'm going to make a message type. That is going to be an object graph type of message. And then inside of there, we're going to define what the attributes have. So if we remember before, we have a phrase, right? So we've got public message type as the constructor. And then inside of there, I'm going to have a field, and it's going to be a string graph type. And then the description of it. So we're going to have the name of it's going to be phrase. Then we're going to have the phrase to say to the person as the description of it. And then lastly, how are we going to resolve it? As in, what's the function we're going to run? So I'm going to go context, which is the overall context that it's resolving in. And I'm simply just going to say context.source.phrase. Now, it can pick that up from that message. It's complaining at the moment because we need to bring in our dependencies. So if I bring that in, that'll all go away. And the last part I need to do is just put a semicolon there to close that off. Now, that's our message type done. That's what GraphQL can return. So with our types done, both on the class side for C# and then also for our GraphQL, we can do our query. So let's go ahead and create another file called resolvers. Now make sure it's resolvers.cs because it is a C# file. When inside there, same thing as before. I'm going to take that namespace that I had and I'm going to put that inside. So they're all sitting inside the same namespace. Then after doing that, we're going to start to write our resolver. So we're going to go here and go public class query. And then again, this is going to be an object graph type. This time not implementing anything though. And then we're going to go public query, open brackets, close brackets. And then we're going to say what our query is going to be. So it's going to return back a message type, which is what we spoke about before. And then we know that it's going to be called say hello because that's what we saw. I'm going to put lowercase at the beginning because GraphQL is a bit picky about that. Next, I'm going to go say a phrase as the description. And then next, I'm going to put, again, how do we resolve it? So I'm going to go resolve context. And then I'm going to go, well, we're going to create a new message. And then on that new message, we're just going to put a phrase. So I'm going to go phrase equals, hey, what's up? What are you looking for at the moment? And that's going to be my phrase that I bring and speak back to the user. Now, if I go return message now, that's going to be it. Same thing, I'm going to need the semicolon here to close it off. The other thing I'm going to need to do is bring in my dependencies. So we're going to go here and bring them in. So if I go up here, I'll do this one first and I'll go GraphQL types. The other one that I'm going to do as well, I'm just going to tell it to use GraphQL as well. Now it's not going to use that, but you will use that at another point. Now that's my resolver done. Now if I go back to my GraphQL code that I had in the first place, you'll now see that there's no errors there. Now I just quickly want to run you through this piece of code now. So we've got our schema defined. And then what you can see here is that when we execute it, we're passing in three different things. So we're passing in the schema, the query that we spoke about before, and any inputs we had, i.e. the variables. We're then going to return them. So let's have a look at running what we just wrote. So let's go across to Postman and let's execute it. So opening up Postman again, we're going to be here. Now we're going to need a URL to go against. So let's start the Azure function. So going to terminal, we can go here and I can just say func and then I can just say start. That's then going to start up my API endpoint. Because it was an HTTP endpoint, I'm going to have basically that URL here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. After copying that, I'm going to put that in and I'm simply just going to go send. And with that, you'll notice that I get my, hey, what's up? What are you looking for at the moment? And it's as simple as that. That's how GraphQL endpoint stood up. And with that, we're ready to upload it to Azure Functions. Now that's your GraphQL done. It can be uploaded to Azure now, like I said, but we've defined a simple type. We've got a simple query in there. You can extend that out. So bring in new attributes, new types, support new queries. Remember, each of the resolvers could also resolve out and do different things. So one could talk to one system, and then you could have another resolver talking to a different system. There's lots of different options. So with that, let's now recap what we just looked at. Recap time. We implemented an Azure function. It was done in .NET, and we defined a GraphQL schema. That GraphQL schema had one query. That was the say hello query. There was a single message type being returned. Now that message type was implemented through a class called message, and yes, that was a normal C# class. So yes, GraphQL types are implemented through C# classes. Now those GraphQL types are then returned through resolving different queries. Now what you saw today was just the start. We still have to do things like mutations, arguments, handling the cache. There's just so much to talk about when it comes to GraphQL, and that's why I encourage you to stay tuned for further videos. Now, if you liked that one, make sure you hit the like button, and more importantly, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, as I'll be uploading many more videos in the future, and I'm sure you want to be notified about them. Well, with that, that's Code to Make Data. I'm Travis Sansom, and I'll see you in the next one.